Hi, everybody. Welcome back. I promised you two stories about Africa, so this is the second one. Much like the first one, it's not a happy story by any means. It's a hate-filled story, but it's one of those things that falls under the category of you need to hear it just to make sure that we never repeat something like this. So this is the story of apartheid in South Africa. So, if you remember, South Africa was one of the first colonies of Europe in Africa. The Portuguese were there, the Dutch were there, and the British were there. And maybe if you remember, the British and the Dutch fought over this territory. Those were called the Boer Wars. Europeans or the white ancestors of those European settlers controlled the government in South Africa. And in 1910, they passed a law called the South African Act. This act said black representation is banned from parliament, which basically meant there were no black people serving in the South African government. What came next was a series of laws that ordered the removal of black people living with or living near white folks. So these laws were the Native Land Act, the Natives in Urban Areas Act, and the Urban Areas Act. They all sound pretty similar and they all did pretty similar things. They forced black people to move out farther out into the colony away from white people. Black people were forced to live on what were called reserves or locations. In other words, this was forced segregation. And this lasted up until World War II. So after World War II, it's 1948, and there's a very important election in South Africa. It's the United Party versus the National Party. The United Party wants to bring all of this or take all of this back. In other words, they want to integrate the races. They want everyone to go back to living together. The National Party is the complete opposite. They want more forced segregation. So, as you might guess, the National Party wins. Black folks in South Africa couldn't vote. The National Party stirred up a lot of fear in South Africa. They told the white folks that they were going to lose their jobs. The Afrikaners, which, if you remember, that those were the ancestors of the Dutch, they pushed for increased segregation, and there was a lot of gerrymandering going on in this election, which is, if you remember from civics, the idea that boundaries are drawn in such a way that that the same people can expect to win the election. It's a way for the people running for office to choose their voters. So all of this results in the National Party winning the election. Um, it's it's kind of unusual to think about because the vast majority of citizens in South Africa were black. If you look at my chart up here, you see in South Africa, almost 73% of people were black and 15.5% people were white. But this National Party designed a government where that 15.5% white would be in charge. So this is what's called apartheid. I'm not sure if you remember from the last lesson or if that's just a word you've heard before. The literal translation is apartness. It just means racial segregation. So at the side here is a pretty famous sign at one of the beaches. What came next was the Population Registration Act. This put people into four categories: white South Africans, Asians, colored, and black. Colored was the term back then. It meant someone of mixed race. So once they got you into one of these four categories, you would be assigned one of these IDs that you would have to carry in case you ever had to prove your race. So if you look at them close, you can see it says white person on this one, and this one says colored, And this one here also says white. Next came the Group Areas Act. This is pretty similar to the laws that were passed before World War II. This was the one that sought to split up races. So if you were black, they would move you out of the areas where white people were. The government was not playing around here. This was not a choice. If you didn't move, they'd knock down buildings and they'd make you move. Of course, white people were always given the best land. They were given the land in the cities. Black people were often given barren tribal land or polluted industrial land. Next comes the Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act and the Immorality Act. This banned marriage and sex between people of different races. The Reservation of Separate Amenities Act came next. It guaranteed segregation in public places. So, segregation at beaches, parks, restaurants, schools, bathrooms, stores, and churches. In 1952, a protest was organized and many people were arrested. The police beat the protesters, which discouraged a lot of future protests. This kind of started a pattern of the separation being brutally enforced. In 1960, police opened fire on a protest, killing more than 60 people. Most of them were shot in the back. In 1977, police closed many of the high schools attended by black people in an effort to break up what they thought would be resistance efforts. The police responded with violence against the protesters. They just hit everybody. There was blood, cries. I remember we were shouting, "Peace, peace, peace." Police threatened to take troublemakers to the 10th floor to the workshop. Fatal accidents tended to happen there. We knew what the workshop meant. It meant death. In 1986, police officers burst into David Mbeka's home and took him to the police station. They assaulted me with fists, they kicked me, and I fell on the ground. They didn't ask me anything. They didn't tell me what to do. What did they even want? In 1990, Ellen Moshwu was shot in the back while walking to church. 18,000 people would be arrested for protesting apartheid. While apartheid was mostly race motivated, it's important to know that there was also an economic motivation. What I mean is, these laws kept black people from being employed in better jobs. It forced them into low paying jobs, especially mine work. And this was important because it made sure that these mines were extremely profitable in South Africa. Education for black people was often minimal to make sure that there was a ready force of mine workers, and the education was often geared toward manual labor. Before it was over, there would be 148 apartheid laws. Eventually, black people were stripped of their citizenship, which meant they had no political power to fight back against this. So eventually, the African National Congress organized, and this was a group that set out to protest apartheid. So they would organize protests, boycotts, and sit ins Their actions were inspired by Gandhi in India. One of their young leaders was a man named Nelson Mandela. His real name was Rol La La. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce it. Um, I know that name translates to troublemaker, and of course, he would be a troublemaker for the South African government. The reason he got called Nelson is his teacher in school found his name too difficult to pronounce, and so she started calling him Nelson, and it stuck for him. While he was inspired by Gandhi, he and Gandhi weren't always on the same page. Nelson Mandela found that nonviolent resistance wasn't working. He believed violence would be necessary to end apartheid. He became involved with a more militant wing of the movement, and though he still believed in nonviolence, he participated in violent acts. His group was responsible for 57 bombings. They hit military installations, power plants, and transportation centers. Mandela said these targets were selected specifically because they didn't want to hurt anybody, and they tried to bomb them at times when they knew no one would be there. I don't know if anyone was actually hurt in these attacks or not. He was tried for sabotage and treason and found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. Under protest and from outside pressure from other countries, Nelson Mandela was released after having spent 27 years in prison. When he was released from prison, he worked with President F.W. de Klerk to tear down apartheid. So in the photo here, he was actually awarded the Nobel Peace Prize along with President de Klerk for their efforts in breaking down apartheid. In 1994, South Africa had its first universal free election. In other words, the first election where black people were allowed to vote. And they elected Nelson Mandela as the first black president of South Africa. So the election of Nelson Mandela is often considered the end of apartheid in South Africa. Um, just telling this story, it reminds me a lot of the segregation laws in the United States. Um, if you remember from To Kill a Mockingbird, like the Jim Crow laws, stuff that, of course, would continue up until the 50s and 60s and not end until the Civil Rights Movement. Um, what strikes me about this is some of these things went on until the 1990s. I mean, that's very, very recent history. I mean, during my lifetime, during I'm sure your parents' lifetime. Um, Another thing that strikes me about this story, Nelson Mandela, I feel like today is thought of as a saint, but he's the first person to say, "Hey, I'm not a saint," unless you think of a saint as a sinner who keeps on trying. I think those are wise words. I think in history, we often want like easy categories for somebody. We want somebody to be good, somebody to be bad, somebody to be a saint, or somebody to be a sinner. Um, Nelson Mandela uh, is not a saint. He'd be the first one to tell you that he had a lot of time in prison to change his thinking, and he really became someone that reformed and changed his country for the better. But he's also would tell you he made some mistakes earlier in his life. Um, he says a saint is a sinner who keeps trying. I think there's an important lesson to be learned there. It's not really where you start, it's where you end up. It's through making mistakes that we learn to try and become better. And that's it. That's the story of apartheid in Africa. This is actually the last presentation I have for Africa. So, what I'd like you to do next, I have a list of problems that are currently facing Africa. You're going to pick one of those and make a public service poster about that issue. So I'll be sure and post that in Schoology. Thanks for playing my video. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you later, everybody.